Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Battle Gamer, and it's tier list time again, as we have now done another 2 letters of the alphabet. It's not always going to be like 2 letters of the alphabet. The first one, A to B, and this one, C to D, is predominantly because each of them had like a good number, and I didn't want to make each of these tier list videos too long. And with the two combined, this is 33 archetypes. That's a lot of archetypes. We're barely maybe 20% of the way through all the total archetypes in the game, but we're making progress. So today we're going to be adding to the list and updating, because there was at least alter ego in the A, letter group that got added to the game since the last tier list, and I will make sure to add any missing letters as we go on. I'm sure that will come up as the videos go on. And as well, one big thing about this tier list I think is very important is that I actually do all the video, or all the classes, as their own videos. So any class you see here, I have done a video and you can check it out. So you can, I'll put a marker here to the playlist if I can do that. If I can't, then ignore this. But yes, so tier list. I don't want to spend too much here on the introduction time. So let's just go over the rules real quick. You can even check out the last video to verify. But essentially, I'm going to rate all these archetypes based on some things. It's not going to be like a 100% like down to the minutia rating. It's just going to be vague, whatever I feel is appropriate. I do have categories and I do have a scoring system, and the scores come together and they get a rank based on more or less like the average of their scores between their accessibility. So how accessible these archetypes are to any classes that might be looking to pick this up to add to whatever the character idea is. The functionality, does the archetype do what it set out to do, and does it do it well? And the fantasy fulfillment, does the archetype provide enough of a change or anything interesting for a character to change that character's fantasy like appearance, aesthetic, or even mechanical feel? I think that's a very important category. And as well, when it comes to accessibility especially, I'm going to be working under the assumption that you're taking the free archetype bonus rule, as I feel like that makes more archetypes feel better and can make them really add to your character rather than have to make a choice between something that your character needs to function well versus something that's a little bit more on the flavor side. That is what you should keep in mind. Obviously, if you don't play games with the free bonus archetype rule, then your choices might be a little bit more limited. But I don't feel like that's necessarily a reason to write off archetypes, as some players might choose to lose some combat efficiency for the sake of roleplay or being able to do some other kind of job, and I don't feel like they should be punished for that. So this is mostly for consideration of people who do want to use archetypes that want to add something to their character that their classes might necessarily not be able to do. So all that out of the way, I score each of the categories 1 to 5 points, and then their average score gets them an S through D ranking. So we don't need to go over the math. All you need to know is that if they do bad in all the categories, they're going to get low on the list, and they do great in all the categories, they're going to get high on the list. And that's just kind of how it works. Let's get into it, shall we? And today we're going to start off with Alter Ego, which was the one added to the A list since the last time we did this list. Alter Ego is a very interesting archetype, in my opinion. I think it's very interesting. Accessibility-wise, it requires you to be trained in deception and stealth, and to get some of the later feats, you do need to be master in those two skills. So this can be a little rough for characters that are not necessarily looking to hyper-invest into its job per se. It's not something you can just slap onto any character and do whatever we're doing with it. I'm still going to mark it at 4 points, because if you're going a hard combat character and you are not super worried about like having a high athletics or anything, and deception is good in combat, feinting is a very important skill that you should be using in combat a lot. So having a good deception is not bad whatsoever. I think it's really good. I don't think it's completely accessible to everyone, but I think there's a lot going. So accessibility wise, I'm going to give it 4 points. As far as functionality, so the whole point of the alter ego is that you mimic someone's job, or you mimic a type of like service career. They have a lot of things that allow you to essentially be a good spy. You can implant yourself into certain environments. You get skills actually when you're impersonating. So while you're impersonating someone, you get a lore skill, and then eventually with some of the skill feats you can get some trained, or not trained proficiencies, but you can essentially get some what's it called? It's what like the investigator gets, where you add your level to your proficiency to 2 skills appropriate for the job that you're attempting to mimic, which is really good. It can offer a lot of very interesting character elements, and not only that, the alter ego offers a lot of skill feats, which is really good, because for as far as like archetypes are concerned, you need to get 3 feats in order to pick up another archetype. This is really good because you can get skill feats, which don't take from your normal feat load. So you can actually swap out, or not swap out, but you can also pick up another archetype a lot easier when you have archetypes like alter ego that have a lot of these skill feat types. It's really good. It allows you to do a lot of feat implementation into your builds without having to actually necessarily invest too much into alter ego itself. It fits in really well. It does its job, I think, really interesting. I do think it's a little complicated, and some of the feats just don't, like, one of the feats is literally you just don't need to buy a disguise kit to do the impersonate action. So that's good. It's a skill feat, so I can't be that angry about it, but I don't know. And then they have a weird like combat one where you can slip into a mirror and grab someone who's next to another mirror reflective surface. Really good, interesting, but I don't know. It's a little wonky in my opinion. I think it is like a 4.5. I'll give it 4 points, but it could be a 5 arguably, as far as like what it can do, and the fact that you can slot it into a build without too many actual like class feat investments with the skill feats added in. As far as the fantasy is concerned, Change Face, that one I mentioned before that lets you essentially do the disguise action without a disguise kit, is really cool. You have like this rippling shard glass mirror aesthetic kind of feel to it. I think that's really cool. I also really enjoy how much this allows you to kind of step into the role and impersonate people, even picking up skills that your character doesn't innately have to help better mimic the role. It's a really, really good archetype, and I think it very successfully does exactly what it is, which is you're just really good at mimicking different people in the job. This is perfect for any spy-like characters, or any characters that are really good at like something in, like a hitman character could really utilize this one. And some of the mirror aesthetics and everything like that does really add to it. I feel like it's a little too reliant on the mirror aesthetic, but I don't feel like it contrasts too much with what a character might do in those roles anyway. So I'll actually give that one a 5. Yeah, I'll give that one a 5, which is interesting, actually. Now that I think about it, I didn't really expect Alter Ego to do this well as far as my ratings are concerned. But with 4 points in its accessibility, 4 points in its functionality, and 5 points in its... I did the thing again! And 5 points in its fantasy fulfillment, it actually puts Alter Ego at S. Because that's 4, 4, 8, plus 5, 13, which is the minimum required for an S ranking. I didn't expect that. It does its job really well. If you want to have a archetype that makes you a better spy, or you want to add to even your combat character, because a lot of the feats are skill feats specifically, it's really good to slot into a character without that much actual investment from your more combat related class feats. So it's pretty good, honestly. I would say it's a really good archetype. All right, next up on the list is Captivator. And Captivator is actually in my list of my top 5 favorite archetypes in the game. And we'll see how it does in the ranking. I never know these rankings ahead of time. I just look at the archetypes and then I kind of just let the brain do the rest of it. But I have an idea how Captivator will probably do. So, accessibility. You do need a Charisma 14 and you need to be trained in, oh, what was it? You need to be trained in your deception or diplomacy. So it has one skill requirement and a stat requirement, but it doesn't require really anything else. So it's not bad. I would say it kind of lacks accessibility for characters who don't really use their charisma. I mean, this is an archetype completely dedicated around the use of illusion and enchantment style spells and kind of intermixing them with a bunch of cool functionality like turning some spells into reactions instead and everything like that. I think it all works really well. But it's predominantly a spell casting archetype as well, so classes like the Magus might really suffer with it because they're really reliant on spell striking for a lot of their damage potential, and spell casting outside of that is rough. It can be mixed in, but I think it's a little bit rougher. You do get a good amount of spell slots, and you get up to master in the occult spell casting with it, which is really good. But I'm talking functionality. Let's talk about accessibility here. So accessibility, I feel its accessibility, it's kind of like a 3 to 4 range, honestly. It's not good for classes that aren't looking for spell casting, so Barbarian it's really not a good one for. And if you're already a class that does a lot of spell casting itself, this just kind of adds to it rather than really provides much anything different. Also the charisma, I'm going to give it a 3. It's good for characters who really want to invest in their charisma and like their deception or diplomacy, and good for characters who really want to kind of add some extra spell casting and have some really cool interactions with it. But I do feel like it's very limited on the type of characters that would. A straight combat character might not take this because the charisma investment might not be, worth it to them. So I'll give it a 3. As far as functionality, I was kind of going into this before. It does change. Like you can do, I think, like a level 1 spell as a reaction, which is really cool. Like command as a reaction. And it gives you some extra spell slots. And I think it also allows you to, eventually you'll be able to like retry a spell if it fails. It's really good. It is limited to all arcane and occult spells that have the enchantment and the illusion traits. So it doesn't require a lot of thinking to get a lot out of it, but I do think it does offer a lot. Again, it doesn't fit into some class styles, and so I'm also unfortunately going to have to give it a 3 as far as its functionality. I think it's good. I think if it's something you want to invest into, it's really good at what it's trying to do. But it is spellcasting is limited in that way, and not only that, but how some of the feats work and trying to get the most out of the archetype, I feel it requires a lot more thinking than a lot of our other archetypes do. So I think a 3 is very fair. You could argue for a 4 though. As far as the fantasy fulfillment, I think it's really good. Essentially, aesthetically, what it is your character is so charismatic that their words start to carry the weight of spells. And even though you're still casting spells, so you need to like gesticulate and do whatever to do magic as per normal, I love the feeling behind it, and I think a character who can really carry forward with the aesthetic of the Captivator can get a lot out of it. And not only that, but you do get 9th level spells, and I think up to master level spell casting with the Captivator as well. It's just it's really good. It's really good as a spell casting kind of add-on to a character who isn't necessarily a full-on spellcaster, but even if you are a full spellcaster, this can really expand your list. I think divine spellcasters could really benefit from this, like the cleric specifically. And a cleric doing this in conjunction with being like under a god of trickery, I think is a perfect blend. So overall, I'm going to give its fantasy fulfillment a 4. It doesn't really add anything super unique to the casting of the spells, but it is very specific to the casting of the spells, so it feels a very trickster or illusionist kind of style, though I don't think it adds enough to make it super unique. So with that in mind, 3, 3, and 4, that's a total of 10 points. That is going to put it in the A category, correct? Yes, right above, 1 point above B. So Captivator goes into A. All right, next up is Cathartic Mage. And if you've seen my Cathartic Mage video, I already have kind of mixed feelings about this one, but we'll go ahead and see. We'll talk about it and we'll see how it goes. Cathartic Mage accessibility. So Cathartic Mage is really not that bad. You need either a 14 charisma or the ability to cast spells from spell slots, which is pretty good, honestly. Stat requirements is not very uncommon for getting a archetype that requires or that gives you spellcasting anyway. So that's not super unusual. And because it uses, or because you can also go with spell slots, I would say most characters could get access to Cathartic Mage if they really wanted to, as long as they, have charisma as one of the stats that they boost at least every once in a while, or at least starting out getting like a 14 in charisma is not that hard. I would give it a 4 overall for its accessibility, because it, like, having or any kind of spell slots allows any spellcaster to pick this up regardless of their charisma. And any martial class can easily put into charisma because deception and feinting is really good and you should utilize it. I'm not going to give it a 5 because if you're a character who doesn't plan on feinting, it's obviously not going to work for you. But a 14 charisma is a very small price to pay for essentially a spellcasting class. Or archetype anyway. But functionality, let's talk about functionality, shall we? So I would say the biggest takeaway from Cathartic Mage is that it's just a really good archetype to give yourself spellcasting if you're already a spellcaster. If you're not a spellcaster, Cathartic Mage, I feel, adds a lot more complexity to picking up spellcasting than normal. The whole catharsis bit, I feel like there's a lot of weird functionality with the catharsis bit, and I feel like this class is kind of a struggle to understand how to really get the most out of it. And I think what a lot of people end up taking from Cathartic Mage is mostly just the spell casting. The catharsis is just something that I don't feel like a lot of the catharsises like work that well and can be a bit of a struggle to pick up. And even the one action that allows you to kind of work yourself up to get your catharsis, you can't then cast a spell with it because it's 2 actions. It's really weird. So as far as spell casting archetypes are concerned, I'm gonna give this a 3 because it's got a little bit more going for it than, let's say, multi-class archetyping into a spellcaster. But even then, you can pick up feats from that spellcaster, from that whole class list, if you were really trying to. This does, I'll say it's a little bit even, honestly. Either way, you can get some spell casting. I just feel this one is very complicated and it's really hard to get a lot out of it intentionally. So I'm going to give it a 3. Fantasy fulfillment. It's a lot of people wanted to argue that, like, it's already if someone is going to misuse an archetype anyway, it's not the archetype's fault, it's the person's fault. I just feel that this archetype in particular really lends itself to being abused by bad role players or players who might not have the social understanding enough to implement this well in role playing. I feel it's awkward. Not only that, it's only based on emotion, which could be some really interesting character fantasy. I'm not going to give this 1 point. I won't even give this 2 points. I'm going to give this, I think, 3 points in the fantasy element, because the catharsis is something that can be hard to pull off. And your character then has to be kind of focused around the catharsis for the roleplay to really come out. And there's not really a lot done with it. Now, there are focus spells you can pick up depending on which catharsis you pick that can kind of play into things. But I don't know. I don't feel like this overall adds a fantasy other than you're a weird mage who kind of uses emotion for spell casting. I think it's really weird. I think it could be argued to be a 4 if there's someone has a really good idea for it, but I think like inherently it's just kind of a 3. It's kind of like there, you can do something with it if you put enough effort into it, kind of like how the functionality is, where you can really get something out of it if you really work hard at it. But this archetype just isn't easy to utilize, so I'm gonna give it a 3 in its fantasy fulfillment. That being the case, 4-3-3, this is going to be the same as Captivator, actually. This is going to be another A. Surprisingly, I thought it was going to be a B for sure. And, it's arguable. Actually, I'm going to stick with it. I would say spellcasting isn't for all characters either. So putting it at a 3 for its excess, I actually agree with that. Spellcasting isn't necessarily for everyone, for all character styles. So I'm going to give it a 3, like across the board. It's a middle of the road. It's at the top of the B's, if that makes you feel better. But yeah, and now I think about it, like spellcasting in general is just something that is not meant for all character styles. So it makes the accessibility just kind of a little awkward. It's easy to get though, but whether it actually works in your build, I think, is a different story altogether. Okay, next up is the Cavalier dedication. And this is one of those kind of archetype dedications that I feel like it's a little unfair when stacking them up against other archetypes, because the Cavalier is one of the few archetypes that was kind of implemented as like a whole additional subclass. Like it's got a lot of good features, and if you're using the bonus archetype rule, it's like picking up another class essentially and adding it to your own, which is really cool. Accessibility wise, it's really easy. All you need to get access to it is to be trained in nature or society, though you do need expert for nature if you want to pick up all the feats. Even that is really not that bad, and it's just one feat that requires that. So if you go society and want to go like the noble knight kind of aesthetic, you can still get all the other feats besides one, and that one I don't even think is really anything that major. I'll double check real quick. It's not anything that major. It gives you access to quick mount, which quick mount is a really good feat, honestly. Something I would probably even push for, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary. So as far as accessibility is concerned, this is pretty good. Honestly, it's really good for a lot of different play styles. I think it's a little rough if you're playing something like a Magus, who has a very heavy action load, or if you're using any class that has a lot of, has a very intense action economy need. But I think for most classes, it can be worked. And even for a Magus, it can still work, and you get that extra functionality because essentially the Cavalier is just a class that is very focused around a mounted animal companion. And so a lot of their actions are very much focused on that. But having the mount does give you some access, like that one action to command your mount to stride or strike or stride twice or whatever can give a character a lot of functionality and maneuverability, really. So yeah, you know what? Accessibility wise, I think anyone who would want to take this can easily do so and be quite justified in doing it. So I'm going to give it a 5 in its overall accessibility, which is actually kind of impressive. Next up is the functionality, and it does exactly what it says on the tin, honestly. It has all the animal companion feats. It has a lot of feats based on defending your mount, mounting your mount, doing actions with your mount. Then they even added some kind of chivalry style feats with the Knights of Last Wall book, which I think was very cool. It very much fulfills its aesthetic, and it does everything you would want it to do. You can play as a chivalrous mounted combatant. I'm not going to give it a 5 though, because I think overall being mounted is just something that is rough to do in all situations. There's going to be a lot of situations I feel being mounted is not going to be the best, and most of its features requires being mounted. You can do it in some dungeons, understandably. I say most, as long as, you know, it doesn't matter. But, like, there's a lot of situations I feel that having your mount, like, ready for combat is going to be a little rough. So I think I'm actually going to give its functionality a 4. I think it does what it wants to do really, really well. It's only being knocked down for just how, like, feasible it is to be mounted all the time. And when you're not mounted, you're losing out on a lot of this archetypes based features. So I mean, even then, your mount can do a lot of good things in combat despite not being mounted on anyway. So you still get a good animal companion. It's still really good even when you're not mounted. But I feel like in the many situations that you wouldn't be mounted, or, you know, feasibly wouldn't be mounted, it is not necessarily that good. So I'm going to go ahead and give it 4 points there. And fantasy fulfillment. I mean, you get a really good mount, you get a bunch of extra features that can kind of give you like some chivalrousness and some defensive qualities. I don't think it offers really all that much outside of combat as far as fulfilling the fantasy, though. Everything outside of combat kind of, unfortunately, is fulfilled by the character themselves and not anything that this archetype is actually giving it. So, as far as fantasy fulfillment, I think in combat it works really well, but out of combat it doesn't. I'm actually going to give it 3 points for its fantasy fulfillment, as there's not much beyond its actual combat feats that fulfill the character's fantasy. The rest of that has to be kind of done by your role playing, but mechanically it fulfills the fantasy very, very well. So, that's going to be 3 points for fantasy fulfillment, 4 points for its overall functionality, and 5. So that's a grand total of 12, right? I think that puts it at the top of A. Yes, because 13, 14, 15. So another A. Not bad. Cavalier's really, really good. I think, oh gosh, my face cam might actually be getting in the way soon. I'll adjust it here in a second if I have to. But yeah, so no, actually, I'm going to do it now. Let me 1 second. Okay. You're not going to see, I guess, Duelist here at the end. We'll have to figure something out for future tier list videos. But anyway, so Cavalier, I think it fits perfectly in A. It's a really, really good archetype in general. I think just, if anything, it's just too focused on combat to really shine like some of the other archetypes have been. All right, next up is the celebrity archetype dedication, and it's an interesting one. So I will give it this: as far as accessibility is concerned, there is no actual skill requirement to be a celebrity. In fact, the whole aesthetic behind the celebrity is that you're a character who craves the spotlight and is someone who's outstanding in their field, someone, you know, like, aesthetic wise, it's for characters who have made a name for themselves in some form or fashion. So it's really good, I think, accessibility wise for that fact alone. But I feel like a lot of its feats and why you would take this isn't really quite there, especially with Dandy, which we'll get to here in a bit, doing a lot of that kind of stuff. I feel even better, honestly. This has a lot of like more combat style abilities, which is very weird. It's also a very short archetype. I don't know. I'm sure there's some characters who might take this. I feel like accessibility wise, I don't know how many characters actually really want to take celebrity, honestly. Like, it's meant for very particular niche, I think, character ideas. I don't think this can be slotted into like anything to really make it run. So I'm actually going to give it a 3. It's a 3 because anyone can pick it up. There's no skill requirements. So there's no requirements. It's just whether or not you would pick it up and what it can like actually offer you. I don't really think a lot of people would want to pick it up. And so like overall, like accessibility wise, I just feel like it does work for any character who wants to take it, but I don't think it adds anything to every character, especially with the ability to fascinate people, to force them to look at you, or to one-up people with certain skill actions. Like, I feel like a spellcaster wouldn't want to pick up Celebrity because I don't know what it would really offer. So I'm going to give it a 3 just because of how easy it is to access, though a 2 could be argued, I think, for its generally accessibility. Function. Well, I mean, I kind of just said a lot of it. I don't know exactly what it's meant to do. I have a build that uses Celebrity in mind that we'll probably be using here shortly, but it's a very short archetype, so there's not really a lot that it does. And a lot of its features are kind of a little weird, honestly. I just don't know what kind of characters would really want to take Celebrity. And like Never Tire is probably one of the better ones that can be used and a lot of different things. Mesmerizing Gaze could be really good for if you're a tank. Command Attention can also be good outside of combat in situations where, you're trying to help your allies sneak by an area. But I don't know. So I think overall functionality, I'm going to give it a 2. It feels like it really just underperforms as far as like archetypes are concerned. It's also really short, and I just don't know exactly what it's supposed to do. It doesn't feel like it has a clear line of its actual intent of what it's designed. As far as the fantasy fulfillment, I think it does that really well, actually. It's based on a character just being famous. So if you're making a character who's really living up some kind of fame they've made up in their own head, or even some fame they actually earn in game, even along your journey, your party does something amazing and your character starts like letting it go to their head and living up that idea of them, is actually really good. It does offer a lot, and you do command attention through abilities and forcing people to pay attention to you, but it's really good, honestly. I wish there was just more. I wish there was more to Celebrity to let me give it a better rating, because I think that as far as the fantasy fulfillment is concerned, it does that really well. There's not a lot of features that can be utilized that well. Most of them can only be used really in combat, which feels kind of like a miss, honestly. I'm going to give its overall fantasy fulfillment a 4. Yeah, 4. Does that sound good? Let's do the math here, and then we'll see how I feel after that. So that's 3 for accessibility, 2 and 4. That'd be 9 points. I mean, even if I bumped it down to 8, it would still be in the B. So yeah, I guess that's just where I'll have to leave it. But that makes it a solid top of the B. I would even make it, I'd probably do like maybe a 3 for the fantasy fulfillment, just because it doesn't really offer that much, especially outside of combat. So yeah, it's in the mid B tier list anyway. I don't know. I wish they honestly gave, it has 4 feats, so there really wasn't too much about Celebrity in the first place. It's surprising that it got that high at all. All right, next up is Chronoskimmer. And honestly, Dark Archive came out with a lot of really good archetypes, honestly. A lot of really solid archetypes, and Chronoskimmer is definitely one of them. Accessibility-wise, there's no stat requirements. You don't need any skills, stats, or anything. It's really good. The only problem is that it is a rare archetype dedication. So you already need your GM's kind of permission. And not only that, the character is essentially involved with time. Like, they're displacing time, they're manipulating time in some ways. And aesthetically, that might not work in some GM's games. Not only that, but the Chronoskimmer is almost predominantly a pure martial style archetype dedication. It's not really meant for spellcasters. It doesn't really offer much for spellcasters. A lot of the stuff, I mean, Turn Back the Clock can obviously be used by anyone. But like Reversing Charge, Superimpose Duplicate, even something like Combat Premonition. There's a lot of these that really benefit more of a melee fighter. Even something like Space Time Shift is for your strides and they kind of act as teleports. I mean, that could be good for a spellcaster. I don't know. This feels a lot more for marshals than it is, and borrow time is specifically like you gain an extra step, stride, or strike for an action once per minute. So yeah, I feel like this leans more towards marshals, but I don't think is as bad as some other archetypes as far as like the differencing between the two. So I'm gonna say, because it's rare and it is more leaning towards one of the archetypes over the others, or one of the play styles over the others, it leans a little bit more towards marshals than I feel it does for casters. I'm going to put it at a 3 for overall accessibility. The whole time thing, I think, is the biggest part. The whole time thing, and it's a rare archetype, so you might not even get access to it anyway by your DM. And then it's mostly made, I think, for marshals. I mean, Time Mage was also in the time section, so they kind of did one for both. Though I could say, honestly, there are some Chronoskimmer feats that would work good for some spellcasters as well. But I don't feel like it would necessarily be as beneficial as like going into Time Mage, for instance. So yeah, I think a 3 is a very fitting position for this. Functionality, it's really good. It's a really good archetype dedication. It does what it set out to do. Your character is able to manipulate time to their own benefit in combat in a lot of ways, and it does offer a lot as far as positioning, better action economy. You can slow enemies down. You can flank using yourself. You can flank with only yourself, which is really cool. Reversing charge has some really good skirmishing ability. It's really, really good. And I think it does exactly what it set out to do, which is your character is this interesting time manipulator on the combat field that can, more than manipulating the time itself, they manipulate their own time. Or in the case of the one where you can slow enemies, a particular enemy, but it doesn't have too many features like that. Just one feat, as much as I can remember. So you know what? I'm actually going to give it a 5 for functionality, which might be the first in this video today. I'm not sure, but I think Ultra EO also got a 5. So, but yeah, as far as functionality is concerned, it does exactly what you would want it to do, and I feel like any marshal who wanted to take it could get a lot of benefit out of it, and it could very easily fit into a lot of builds. So a 5 for its functionality. As far as aesthetic is concerned, this has some similar problems that some other archetypes have, as almost, I think actually all of its feats are predominantly focused towards combat. So the character fantasy doesn't translate outside of combat. I do like the idea that in combat you kind of have the whole like time rewinding or stabilization. You have a lot of that in combat, and I feel like it feels really, really good in combat. So I think with how it feels in combat for the aesthetic means a lot. I'm not going to give it a perfect score, but I'm going to give it 4 points still for its fantasy fulfillment, because mechanically you do feel like a time manipulating martial character while using this archetype, and I feel it's really, really good. I can't give it a perfect score because it doesn't do anything outside of combat, but I think it mechanically it makes you feel like a time better, which I think is really huge. So that's going to be 3 for accessibility, 5 for functionality, and 4, that is going to be 12 points. That is going to be just shy of an S. This is going to be another A, but this is going to be the top of the A list. There's actually not a lot that have, I think, 12 as a ranking. I don't remember all my ranks exactly, but I know Chronoskimmer's definitely towards the top. Okay, next up is Clockwork Reanimator, which is a really good one. It essentially allows you to create a unique type of companion, an undead companion. And it has a lot of features around hijacking undead and even an ability to revive allies. And the only requirement is that you're trained in crafting, and you actually don't need to get better at crafting. Just being trained in crafting alone gives you access to the rest of the features. Now, this is a rare archetype. So as far as accessibility is concerned, I'm going to I'm going to put it in the... It works really well, honestly. It's rare, and it works... There's a lot of stuff that focus towards undead, which is very niche and might not come up in your campaigns. Not only that, it's rare, so your GM might not even allow you to use it. I do think that a lot of characters can get a good use out of it, because having a companion is really good, and even a full-on revive is very solid. Though you do need a heavy invest, I think, in the undead companion to really get the most out of it, I think. So I'm going to mark it accessibility wise as a 3 as well, like Chronoskimmer, just because it focuses a lot on undead specifically, which might not show up in your campaign, and it is rare, so your GM might exclude you from getting access to it, depending on how the campaign goes and how cool your DM is. I do think animal companions, or companions in general, are really good in this game, and they really just add to your action economy rather than take any away. But that might just not be your character style. I would give this a 4 if it wasn't for like the pure undead focused abilities. But a 4 could be argued. I think a 4 definitely could be argued for the overall accessibility, because I think this could work with a lot of different character styles. As far as the functionality is concerned, it's good. Again, you get an undead companion. It gets a lot of good abilities. You get a revive with Unwind Death. And Zombie Horde makes your undead companion, or your undead construct companion, really interesting. Not only that, but this offers a lot of functionality around your companion specifically. And you can hijack undead. I think it does exactly what it set out to do. It's mostly about your undead companion, but you can affect other undead as well, kind of like as a bonus. And it adds to your companion as well. Unlike Cavalier, that kind of works with their companion more, this one adds to their companion with a lot of their feats and features, which I think is really, really good. So I'm actually going to give it a 5 in its overall functionality. I think it does exactly what it's out to do well. The undead thing is, I think, unfortunate as far as like how often it might come up. But even if you didn't take any of the hijack undead style feats, this would still be a really good archetype in general. So I'm going to give it, I'm going to stick with a 5. As far as the overall fantasy of it, it doesn't really add much, though I do really like what it does. It doesn't have any really out of combat stuff. You do get a really cool, unique companion, though, which I think really gives it a lot of good bonus points. And the fact that your companion with Zombie Horde can just become a mass of moving body parts and can attack multiple creatures as like its own swarm is really, really cool. This doesn't do a lot for your character, but this is really cool for your companion specifically. And the companion is unique enough. I think I'm definitely going to make this a 5 as well for its overall fantasy fulfillment. It's really good. Your character feels like this kind of mad scientist that focuses predominantly on the reanimation and manipulation of corpses and undead creatures. And you could do a lot of that with this. There's just no out of combat stuff, but I feel like with how unique the companion is and the features you can give it that make it even more unique than other companions, more than make up the difference. So that's going to be a total of 13 points. That's going to actually put Clockwork Reanimator as an S tier. Another good one. I mean, we got 4 S tiers with the last tier list, so I'm not surprised that we're getting a couple here. But still, a lot of these are doing a lot better than I thought. All right, next up is Corpse Tender. And I don't know. Corpse Tender is very interesting, I guess. It's a really silly one. The whole premise is that you command mindless undead creatures like other people would for like normal animals. It's not like animal companions are undead companions. It's more like you treat undead like beasts and can kind of tame them in that kind of way. Allows you to make diplomacy on them even though they're mindless, which is really interesting. You do get access to a harm spell once per day, which is cool. But overall, I don't know. So first of all, let's talk about its accessibility. You do need to be trained in religion, But you also need to be in evil alignment, which is rough. Some GMs are very against players having evil alignments. And then on top of that, really, you're like an evil farmhand. I really don't know who would honestly want to go for other than just kind of the silliness. So taking silliness and like a silliness factor into, I would say some people would be interested in Corpse Tender. And if you're allowed to play an evil character and be trained in religion, like being trained in religion really isn't that hard at all. So I'm going to give it a 2. It's a great meme character. It's also, it doesn't have a lot of really good functionality other than just the ability to command undead creatures, which you might not even, yeah. It's very situational. You don't even get an undead companion. There's just other archetypes that kind of just do this way, way better. Or you could just cast Animate Dead. Yeah, this is just, ugh. I don't know. It's a 2. I'll say it's a 2 for the meme. I'll put it above a 1 because it's a 2 for the meme factor. Functionality. It does kind of what it wants to do. It allows you to command undead, and you can even attempt to command intelligent undead too, which is interesting. But as far as like combat potential, it just allows you to have undead minions and be able to heal them a little bit easier, and you get like some functionality to that. Command Undead allows you to attempt to take control of a creature for a minute or an hour, depending on if you pass or fail, and you need the harm. You actually need to get harm somewhere else in order to get. So yeah, honestly, its biggest functionality is for dealing with undead that you just kind of randomly come across more than anything. If you have undead minions and you're using it for your own undead minions in their own way, I think there's some functionality in this, but most of this is just for coming in contact with other undead and being able to take control of them, which is a very niche situation. So functionality wise, I would say that overall, if you have a very undead based game, it's super niche, because I think undead show up as a rather generally common enemy, but not enough that I would warrant like taking this being a great idea unless the campaign is based on undead. So I'm gonna give this a 2 as well. Again, it does some interesting things for minion builds, and I think there's a really good way you could use this with minion builds. But in all honesty, it just doesn't do all that much. And as far as fantasy fulfillment, I mean, I love the aesthetic of it. You're some kind of farmhand who focuses on the manipulation of zombie animals or mindless undead to plow fields. I think that's funny, but this has no out of combat features. Its combat features are not even really good mechanically speaking, as far as like being a corpse tender. It's kind of yikes, honestly. I'm gonna give it a 2 as well, because I gave a 2 for everything else, and I think the meme is great. The meme of corpse tender is great, and I think it has some functionality in some campaigns. I think for the campaign it came out for, it fits perfectly. For any other campaign, I think this would be a very hard one to put in unless you're putting in a very meme character. So that's going to put Corpse Tender as our next C tier, surprisingly. That's 6 points. Yeah, that puts it at the top of C tier. But yeah, it's a... I don't know what to say. Corpse Tender's okay at best and bleh at worst. So it's a great meme build. All right, next up is Crystal Keeper. Similar to the Corpse Tender, this is another specific archetype from a specific adventure path. So, accessibility. It requires you to be trained in either Society or Elven lore. Not too bad. It is a rare archetype, and you can't pick it up until at least level 4, which means if you're using bonus archetype, you can't really start with Crystal Keeper unless you're willing to give up, I guess, a feat for it. So that's already kind of rough, and I don't know why it starts off at that level. It allows you to decipher using any of the intelligence-based, regular skills, Arcana, Occultism, Religion, or Society when you're deciphering writing. And when you crit fail, you get a normal failure instead. And when you get a success, you get a crit success, which is pretty good. Plus an additional 10 damage to crystal hazards, which is very weird. I don't know. Overall, the most functionality comes with armor rune shifter and weapon rune shifter. And that's what I feel like people would take this archetype for. A lot of it is more kind of fluff than anything. Decipher writing doesn't really come up in a lot of games I've seen. And crystal hazards are also really unusual. So, I don't know how often that one will come up. I really gotta say that as far as accessibility, the high level cap plus it's also a rare archetype dedication as well. So your DM needs to allow you to give you access to it. And you need to be trained in society, which is not hard, but it's still a requirement in comparison to some of the other ones. I'm really gonna give this one, I think, a C or a 2 points. Yeah, I think I'm gonna give this 2 points as far as overall accessibility. It's just it doesn't work well with free archetype. It's a rare archetype, and the archetype itself isn't that appealing to a lot of different character types, except for very specific ones based around decipher writing and some of the extra functionalities you can get with some of the cantrips. So yeah, I don't know. I don't perceive a lot of characters considering Crystal Keeper for their builds, as I think it's a very specific character type. Really, this is aimed towards, which is really rough. Functionality wise, it has some decent functionality. I mean, if you're gonna go into really making a character around decipher writing, this is really a must pick because it gives you not only when you crit fail, you get a failure instead, but when you get a success, you get a crit success instead, just for picking up the base dedication. On top of that, you can use any of the Arcana, Occultism, Religion, or Society for decipher writing. So if you were playing a very intelligent wizard who had high Arcana, who wanted to also do decipher writing using, your weird arcane methods, I think it has really good functionality. The Crystal Ward spell is kind of meh. The simple crystal magic that gives you Read Aura and Sigil. Sigil is a very meh cantrip. Read Aura can be really good though. Armor Rune Shifter and Weapon Rune Shifter, I think, do have some really good functionality, being able to shift one of your runes on a piece of armor and a weapon once per day to a different one can be really, really good. So overall, I will give it a 3, mostly because of Armor Rune and Weapon Rune Shifter. But I feel like there are characters who would like this for its other features and its roleplay features as well. Speaking of its roleplay features, I think this has a lot of really good roleplay potential. It's rooted in elven culture. It's very interesting. There's a big crystal aesthetic, which could be really interesting to add to your character, and your ability to kind of get some the ward spell is based on a crystal. You use a crystal when you shift the runes. You actually need a crystal to focus on to get access to the cantrips, which is kind of weird. But as far as aesthetic goes, I feel like it's pretty good aesthetic wise. I'm not going to say it's perfect because, I mean, it doesn't really give you a lot that makes you feel like, I guess, a crystal keeper in a sense. Other than, I guess it kind of does. I don't know. I think it's very good. I think that if the functionality for everything was more orientated towards something specific, I feel like the overall fantasy for this would be really good. But I feel like this is a really good kind of like aesthetic to add to a spellcaster to kind of give them a little bit more of a spellcastery oomph, more than it is to add anything specific. I'm gonna give it 4 points actually for its overall aesthetic. So that's gonna be 2 for accessibility, 3 for its functionality, and 4. That's going to be 9 points. That's going to put it at the top of B, which I think is fair, honestly. Crystal Keeper is pretty okay. And Armor Rune Shifter and Weapon Rune Shifter are really good, and I can see being used in a lot of builds if you wanted that kind of flexibility. but everything else doesn't really match up to that. The fantasy is good though, so I don't know. I think B is very good for Crystal Keeper. Cursed Maelstrom dedication is really interesting. I actually really like this archetype dedication. I think it adds a lot to some characters, though we'll get into, I think, my overall thoughts on it here. So, accessibility. One, this is a rare archetype dedication, which is rough. And two, your character needs to have been cursed or previously been cursed. There is a rare background that makes your character have been cursed before, which could technically apply. So this kind of has a run-in that allows you to kind of pick it up. It is rare. There are no other skill requirements, though. But being cursed, I think, is something that would prevent a good majority of characters getting necessarily access to, only to characters who are necessarily being built towards this. Regardless, characters can become cursed, I would say, uncommonly in a campaign, but it's not unheard of, and I'm sure it's bound to happen to players eventually. I think overall I'm gonna give it a 3. It's rare, so your GM needs to give you access to it, and you need to be cursed, which is an extra thing, which can be hard to like inorganically do in your story. But if you're working with your GM to pick this up, I don't really feel like there's a lot preventing a GM from letting their player select this particular one. And it's not very niche, I would say. So I'm going to give it a solid 3. I think if you want to make a character who has a very, misfortune kind of aesthetic, this is really good, and your GM should allow you to use this one. But if you're trying to do it and your GM is like, well, if you get cursed, then you can, then I think it'd be very hard. So a 2 could be argued for accessibility here as well. Functionality is interesting. So this does allow you to essentially have like an aura that can curse enemies around you, any enemies in the area. What is it? Oh, I'm sorry. Any characters, so even allies within a 10-foot emanation to you, suffer a -1 status penalty to all saving throws and skill checks due to the storm's bad luck. That actually has some really good functionality, and you can even shoot this storm with Expel Maelstrom at someone else for some other, to give them the effects for up to 10 minutes or up to a permanent, I think, misfortune, which isn't really relevant in most combats, but still interesting. A lot of their other features are more around manipulating curses, which doesn't really come up that often. I would say it's an uncommon appearance in most games. Unnerving Expansion is good. Allows you to attempt to demoralize a creature within your emanation, which is pretty solid. And a Curse Magic gives you some extra spell casting on top of everything. Counter Curse is very interesting. Torrential Backlash allows you to allows you to do an additional d6 negative damage to all creatures in your emanation, which is really cool, though it does end your Maelstrom effect early. I say this is a really okay one. Its effects around curses and like reversing curses or taking the curse from your allies is good, but it's just not very common. Not common enough to really warrant it. Some of the features, I think aesthetically, this is a really good one to add, but I feel like it's overall not suited for most character styles unless you're going for a misfortune styled character. So all that into consideration, I'm going to give it a 3 as well for its functionality. Aesthetic though, it's so good. The curse almost has its own personality where it doesn't allow you to be cursed. It's kind of a jealous entity, which is very interesting. And the role play that can be done with this is really good. The fact that this can come up with narrative reasons, it could be a reason why your character was like kicked out of their village. Has some good background kind of elements to it. I mean, this is honestly a really good archetype for its overall aesthetic. It doesn't necessarily offer too much outside of combat, but it does offer at least some. I'm going to give it 4 points. It's not a perfect score. I think there could be some other things to really make this flourish, like some other archetypes have done. But I do think that this is a really, really good one. And I think a 5 could be argued as far as the aesthetic it's giving for the characters. I just don't feel like enough of the features work in out of combat stuff to really make your character feel unlucky. And not only that, but your unluckiness really doesn't factor into the combat. Like, there's no mechanical feel. Yeah, so I think a 4. I think a 4 just because it doesn't necessarily reinforce itself, but I do think a lot of really good things could be done with it. So with that in mind, 4-3-3, yeah, that's going to put this at a bottom of, or no, top of B? No, bottom of A. Curse Maelstrom. Okay. All right. Not bad. A lot of A's, which is good. That just means that Pathfinder has a lot of archetypes that are, balanced enough that they're pretty good choices, especially for if that's your character's kind of path that you're taking. All right, next up is Dandy. And this one came at me from a blind side. I was not expecting Dandy to be as good as it was, really, or as it is. It's a very solid archetype. So let's talk accessibility. So in order to pick up the Dandy archetype, you need to be trained in diplomacy. Its other features, though, require you to be expert in deception, or master in deception, and master in society if you want to pick everything up. So that's a very heavy skill load. Though I will say, most of Dandy's feats, or at least a good number of them, are skill feats. Yeah, most of them. Only 2, the dedication and gossip lore, are not. So the rest of them are skill feats. So this can fit into a lot of builds, honestly. It has a really high stat requirement, which knocks it down a few pegs. But it is mostly skill feats, which ups it a peg. It's, I would say overall, it is a 4 for accessibility. Not only because it is mostly skill feats, all you gotta do is pick up the archetype dedication, and then you're just good to go. You can easily slot this in. And I feel like any character that wanted to make a social character in any regard, no matter what class, can get a lot out of Dandy. So I'm going to give it 4. It just gets knocked down for its high skill requirements as far as overall accessibility. And not all classes get a lot of skill increases. And this is a very greedy archetype for your skill increases if you want to get the most out of it. Functionality wise, I think it's absolutely amazing. If you want to make a character that is completely combat, but you take one of your combat feats out to put in the dedication feat, you can still get a lot out of this as long as you don't mind your skills going towards the face features. And even then, if you're going for one, like, deception is really good. Deception can be used in combat. So a lot of combat characters could also utilize this. And as well, diplomacy is like if you're gonna use the Dandy, or if you're gonna make a face, Dandy's almost necessary. And you get a lore skill. You get a lore skill that can be used for a lot of different things, which is really good. Honestly, functionality wise, I gotta give Dandy a 5. It does exactly what it says on the tin. It is, if you want to make a face character with very minimal effort, a lot of the Dandy's features is really good for that. It just requires your skill increases. Overall, I think it's really, really good. It does exactly what it wants, and it doesn't even take that many of your feats to get the most out of it, which is just priceless in this game. As far as the fantasy fulfillment is concerned, you know what? Honestly, it doesn't offer too much. It does offer a lot of, like, the initial dedication allows you to affect rumors, which, is really good for a social magne style character. Fabricate connections is also really good, and Party Crasher as well is really good for the overall aesthetic. I don't feel like this mechanically offers too much besides some downtime activities, though gossip lore and distracting flattery can come up in a fair number of situations. So I would say a 3 or a 4 overall for the fantasy fulfillment. I think you could really play it up. I mean, the whole point of it is that your character is very socially adept, and a lot of the features really play into that. It doesn't necessarily make you better at it, but it makes your character well connected. So it takes you part of the way there. I think fantasy fulfillment, it doesn't have a lot of mechanics that really lead into it, but I think some of the exploration activities can really play into it, and the overall idea of it, I think a 3 or 4 could be argued for the overall fantasy fulfillment as well. I'm going to give it a 4 personally. So With all that in mind, that's 3 for accessibility, 5 for its functionality, and 4, that's going to be 12 points. That's going to put it right at the top of A, which is pretty nuts, honestly. It's going to be one of the higher of the A ones as well. Dandy's really good. I'm actually surprised it didn't get an S, but that's just because of its high skill requirements to get everything out of it. Trained in one skill and master in 2 others is a lot. And you don't even become master in the skill that you initially put it into it. So it feels like it goes a little bit all over the place. So yeah, just 1 point difference. And honestly, it could be argued up to an A or up to an S, I feel like, because I feel Dandy's just really, really good. All right, next up is Demolitionist. And Demolitionist, I think, is going to be very interesting, but I don't actually think it's going to do that well on this list. But let's see here. So overall accessibility. There's no accessibility requirements for Demolitionist, honestly. There's just none. And one of the cool things about it is you become trained in engineering lore or expert if you're already trained. Now, I will say that it is going to require your character to have access to bombs. You can buy bombs, and honestly, you can buy bombs pretty cheap. Pathfinder's really good at having accessibility for stuff like this. So, like, honestly, it's really easy to be a demolitionist if you really want to. Now, whether it blends into your character style is a different story, especially because a lot of the features, it picks up a lot of feats straight from Alchemist, which makes me feel like this is more of like an Alchemist subclass style or an augmentation on the Bomber, honestly, more than anything. It's a lot of it is just really, really orientated towards bombs. If you're not planning on using a character who throws bombs, a lot of these features are not going to be good. It does have some good ability for like breaking down walls and blowing stuff up. If you're doing that as kind of like a part of exploration, you're breaking into a place or whatever. I think Demolitionist adds a lot to that. So I'm going to give this a 3. If you want to go for it, I think it's really good, and there's no requirements other than bombs, and bombs are actually pretty easy to get, honestly. And if you're playing something like an alchemist, they're super easy to get, and all you need is alchemical crafting to make your own bombs. So like all you need is some time or just a little bit of gold. It's not that bad to get. It's just whether your character I could see any class who wanted to specialize in demolition picking this up, and honestly they would need to. But I feel like a 2 could be argued because you need bombs. So you need to have access to it. And to get the most out of this, you almost have to kind of play an alchemist. So I'm going to give it a 3 just because it's ridiculously easy to get access to it and bombs. So any character who want to be a demolitionist could be one. But whether you would actually select it or not, I think like as far as pickability, it goes down to a 2. But I'm going to mark it as a 3. I'll give it the benefit of the doubt. Functionality. You need bombs. I just said this a lot, but you need bombs. So you can, if you're not playing an alchemist, you can run out of the bombs, which means all your demolitionist stuff is completely useless, which I feel could be easy to do, but not necessary. I think you could overstock yourself if your game is getting enough gold and everything like that. Its combat feats are okay. I do love Collapse Wall. I think it's a really good feature, but like as far as the combat feature, it's not the best. And a lot of its other features are just all about like setup or setting different situations. It's just I don't feel like this is a good combat archetype. I feel like it's an archetype that if you want to play Demolitionist, you could implement that into combat a bit, but I don't feel like it does really well at that. And its ability to break walls is interesting, or constructs in general is interesting, being able to reduce their hardness. I don't know. I don't feel like it offers enough functionality wise to make it very desirable, other than just the fact that you want to play a demolitionist. And honestly, given the situation, Demolitionist is only really good at breaking things quicker than other characters, but a lot of characters can do enough damage to break down most objects. There are some objects that have a hardness that make it almost impossible for some styles of characters to actually break into it, where this could come in handy. But I feel like you have to play in that. Yeah, I'm going to give its functionality overall a 3. I think a 2 could be argued as well, though. I think a 2 could be argued as well, as I don't feel like combat wise it adds enough to make it worthwhile. And outside of combat, I mean, like, it just time becomes the biggest factor, or depending on how hard the object is. So I don't know. It's definitely interesting, but I feel like it might miss the mark a little bit. So I'll give it a 3. No, you know what? I'll give it a 2. I gave the other one a 3 as a BFD, so I'll balance it by giving this a 3 or a 2. And the overall fantasy fulfillment. Yes, I think it does its fantasy fulfillment really good. You become good at engineering lore, getting either the proficiency or a boost to the proficiency. You have a lot of things about setting up charges, bombs. Any way you can set a bomb up on an object, you can damage things with, you can collapse walls onto people, all kinds of stuff. Mechanically, it really leans into that fantasy. Outside of combat, you can blow things up as well. I think there's a lot of situations where the fantasy fulfillment can, like, if you're thinking with bombs, you can find a lot of solutions that can be solved with bombs. So I do think fantasy fulfillment wise, this does really well. I'm actually going to give it 4 points in its overall fantasy fulfillment, which means this is 9 points. That puts it at the top of B, which I think is appropriate. You could argue a couple points down from it, but I still think it would be a B in the end. I think it's too far from C, but I don't think it's quite enough for an A. Like, Demolitionist could only go down from its current ranking, but I don't think it could go down enough to go to a C. So I think Demolitionist very much is a B rank. But, you know, I think it does what it set out to do really well. And I actually really like Demolitionist. All right, next up is going to be Dragon Disciple, and honestly, this is going to be a really hard one. Dragon Disciple, so I was corrected. Dragon Disciple, it doesn't have a requirement that you're playing a Kobold, Dragonblood Sorcerer, or a Dragon Instinct Barbarian. That's just its access requirement. So technically, any character could get access to Dragon Disciple. There's no actual like requirements for it, though it does have a limitation based on the DM on whether you would be able to take part in it. It's only uncommon though, not rare like some of the other ones we've had on the list today. So overall, accessibility wise, the hard part is I think really the Dragon Disciple mostly plays into spellcasters. Though it does have some non-caster benefits, it mostly plays into spellcasters. I think it could add a lot. They have a good mix between casting like spells and abilities that like increase, like Scales of the Dragon, for instance. If you're unarmored, give you an item bonus with a dex cap, which is interesting. It could be played into very well. And some of the features as well, like give you wings, which any character could really use access to flight, or an additional breath attack on top of everything. I mean, like, even Draconic Scent, giving your character an imprecise scent. I feel like any character could take this. Whether any character would is a different story. The access thing as well, I'm going to mark it at a 4. I think any character could feasibly select some things out of this and get some good benefit out of it. And even with the spellcaster kind of most focus, I think there's a good enough blend of some of the spell features even to enhance martial style characters that they can get something out of it. And as far as access concerned, I mean, your DM just needs to allow you to gain access to it as an uncommon. You know what? No, actually, you know what? I'm going to mark it as a 3 because of the access. I think the access is the part that makes it a little bit harder, because otherwise your GM needs to come up with a good reason why you have access to these dragon-like abilities. So yeah, just because of it's mostly leaning towards, I feel like, magic casting on top of the fact of the access, I'm going to give it a 3, which I think pretty much is in line with everything we've done today so far. Functionality, it does add a lot. You get a lot of features that allow you to like fly, for instance. You get some armor. You can pick and choose a lot of things out of this to augment your character. And I think that the Dragon Disciple is really good at augmenting your character who's already kind of doing something in a way. Dragon Arcana is really good if you're playing a Kobold or if you're playing any other kind of caster who is not innately like an arcane caster, to get access to some new spells that kind of have that dragon aesthetic, which I think is really good. I don't feel like this archetype really leans or functionally pushes in any one direction on what it wants to do. It's kind of okay in general for no matter what you're doing, and it does allow the combination of some really good features in allowing you to essentially do like a whole dragon transformation later on. Shape of the no, not shape of the dragon, mighty no, like the mighty wings feat, for instance, or the disciple's breath allows you to like gain an additional breath attack that's not a spell. I'm gonna say it's just kind of okay overall. I don't feel like it really pushes or does anything super interesting. It just gives you access to features in special or unique kind of ways. So I'm going to give it a 3, I think, as well. It does some good stuff, but I don't feel like it adds a lot. And as far as like what it set out to do, it's just kind of make your character more dragon. It doesn't actually have like the spell functionality is good, but it doesn't push the spell functionality. It can't make like a spellcaster necessarily that much better. It just add some more flexibility. And for martials as well, it doesn't really come with that many really good features to add to being a martial character. It just gives you extra stuff to allow you to do more things, except for flight, because flight is really cool. But like the breath attack is okay, but I mean, I don't know. I'm just not awed by Dragon Disciple, so I'm gonna give it a 3 for its functionality as well. As far as its fantasy fulfillment, it's really good, honestly. You become more like a dragon. You gain wings, scales, claws, all that other kind of stuff. You can enhance your claws if you have the claws like ability already. You get better dragon shapes. You can turn into a dragon more easily. Like if you want to go a dragon themed character, this is the archetype to go. So as far as fulfilling the fantasy it's looking out to, I'm gonna give it a 5. It just, you become a dragon. It gives you dragon stuff. You want to be dragon, it gives you dragon. It doesn't have any non-combat skill stuff, I guess, but your body does become transformed by it, like with the dragon claws, for instance. And eventually you can even breathe fire, like, or whatever element, just without even using like a spell slot, once every so often. So I really think it's really good. A 4 could be argued, but I'm going to give it a 5 because I think it really does make your character very dragony, and that's kind of what it's all about. So with 2 3s and a 5, that's going to be 11. That's going to put it in mid-tier for A, surprisingly, which, I mean, Dragon Disciple was another prestige class from first edition, so I'm not surprised that it kind of matches like Cavalier. Cavalier, I think, did a little bit better as far as its overall functionality, but I think Dragon Disciple is really, really good at what it was set out to do. All right, next up is Drow Shootist, and we're almost done. God, these videos are so long. So Drow Shootist is a very interesting one. Drow Shootist is an archetype and pretty much just focus on hand crossbows with a little bit of poison thrown into the mix. Accessibility wise, it's actually surprisingly really accessible. You just need access to hand crossbows, and hand crossbows are a simple weapon. Most classes gain access to simple weapons with a few exceptions, meaning that anyone could, and all you need is a general feat to get access to hand crossbows to get access to it. Now, whether you would or not is a different question. And this is an archetype almost completely dedicated to the use of a martial weapon. So I don't feel like spellcasters would necessarily get really much out of this. They could still do a little bit. You also need to become trained in crafting to get access to some of the poison feats, but that's like the only thing. So overall, I'm going to say with overall accessibility, I'm going to put it at a 3. It's not great for spellcasters because it's almost completely focused on martial stuff 100%, but it's really easy to access, and even spellcasters could easily get access to this archetype and use it if they're not planning on using spell. Low-level spellcasters might even pick it up just to give themselves an option when they run out of spell slots, but cantrips I feel like would do you better anyway. So yeah, I'm going to give this one a 3. If you like hand crossbows, this archetype will make hand crossbows really good. And speaking of functionality wise, this is a really good archetype dedication for hand crossbows. You get everything you need to make hand crossbows good, plus a little bit of poison mixed in, plus a little bit of skirmishing so you can, move in and out of combat. Running reload's really good. Skirmish strike allows you to step and strike or strike then step. It's really, really solid for everything that is involved. Hand crossbow, though, it is all focused on the hand crossbow, though the poisoner feats could be used on, anything that you would like to have poisons as well. I wouldn't pick this archetype particularly just for that. So as far as functionality is concerned, it's really good for hand crossbows, but it forces you to really focus on hand crossbows. I'm going to give this a 3 as well, as its overall functionality is great and is great for hand crossbows specifically, but overall, unless you're focused on hand crossbows, you wouldn't even look at this archetype dedication. So it does what it is set out to do really, really well, but it's very limiting in that factor. And when I look at a lot of these archetypes, I look at what characters could do with it. And what characters can do with this is use hand crossbows, which, it limits their weapon choices, though it would be a good offhand for some situations. So I think a 4 could be argued, especially when you take the offhand hand crossbow idea as a part of it as well. Last but not least, fantasy fulfillment. There's almost none, actually. The poisoner feat along with the hand crossbow feat. So this is supposed to be you're inspired by Drow, or it's the Drow practices to be really good at hand crossbows, but that's it. You don't get any skill proficiencies towards it. You're just good with hand crossbows, which isn't really a particular aesthetic. And I do like how it does add a lot of good hand crossbow stuff and a mix of poison stuff. The lethargy poisoner stuff is also really good. So rather than a 1, which I would have given this if it wasn't for the poison add-ons, I'm going to give this a 2, because at least with the idea of the archetype, it's a Drow fighting style, which it is. They use poisons and a lot of hand crossbow stuff, at least in the Galarian mythos. So I think at least it does the bare minimum for that. So I'm going to give it 2 points. So 3, 3, and 2, that's 8 points. That's going to put Drow Shootist right into the B category here. Middle of the pack B, you could argue it down. It could almost become a C, but functionality wise, it's really good. If you want to use hand crossbows, it's probably the best archetype for using hand crossbows. So for that fact alone, I would put it above C. So I think it does belong in B. Bottom of B, middle of B, not top of B, but it definitely belongs in the B category. All right, next up is Dual Weapon Warrior, which is a good one. It's a good archetype, so let's get into it, shall we? Accessibility-wise, Dual Weapon Warrior is really good if you like using dual weapons. There are no requirements other than the fact that you must be able to dual wield weapons, which is not actually on there, but technically that would be its only requirement, is you're wielding a weapon in both hands. So pretty much all classes can select this. Now, it's a pure martial archetype dedication, completely focused on martial abilities. So spellcasters, not likely to use this one, especially because it uses 2 weapons and it fills your hands up, making it harder to use material components, which not all art casters have to use, but that's just something to keep in mind as well. I'm going to give this a 3 for accessibility. Any class could use it, but only martials would. If you're a martial that is going to dual wield, though, you would select this archetype. So I think 3 points is a fair amount is for overall accessibility. Any character could use it, but only martials would really want to use it. And yeah, that's about it. And for some of the martials that are not necessarily as combat martials, like Investigator, for instance, could still use it because a lot of, one-handed weapons have finesse or agile, so they could still get their benefits from that. The only one that couldn't really get the most out of this would be... actually, Alchemist can get some really good out of this as well. So yeah, pretty much martial only, 3 points. Functionality-wise, this is the archetype to use with dual weapons. There's not going to be a better one. This even allows you to use a lot of dual weapon feats that the fighter normally gets with thrown weapons and range weapons as well, which means that even gunslingers could potentially pick this up to add to their character. And you even get the ability through this to reload a weapon even though you have a weapon in both hands, which is really, really good. So for all things dual wielding, this is good. It even gives the base dedication itself gives you double slice, which is really good. And then just on top of that as well, you get access to pretty much all the dual wielding feats that the game has to offer. That's a lot of feats. So yeah, I'm gonna give it 5 points. There's nothing else to say. If you want to use 2 weapons, it has all the and Cleansing Slice is such a good feat as well. And the fact that you could use all these with thrown weapons and range weapons, it's really hard to say that this is not just the perfect dual wielding archetype. And last but not least, the fantasy fulfillment section of it, there's none. It's kind of like the Drow Shootist in a way. It's just, you have a lot of dual wielding feats. That's it. It offers no roleplay benefit. There's really no thing. The only thing I will give this is it allows for two-handing like thrown weapons or ranged weapons really cool, which is an aesthetic in itself. Though you wouldn't need this one to be a dual-wielding melee user necessarily, but for those alone, I'm going to up this from a 1, which I would probably normally give this from its lack of overall like fantasy elements, to a 2, because it does allow for the dual-wielding thrower slash gun user to get a lot out of it, which I feel those are very strong aesthetics, and this allows you to more easily do those, though it doesn't do really much else to lend to that kind of aesthetic appeal, as there's really nothing else it adds. So I'm going to give it 2 points there. So for overall accessibility, it's going to be 3. For combat, it's going to be 5. And it's overall, it's fantasy fulfillment, and it's going to be 2. That's 10 points. This puts it at the bottom of the A tier, which I think is quite appropriate, honestly. It's a really, really good archetype overall, but it's not astounding. It doesn't really add a ton to everything. So I feel like Dual Weapon Warrior belongs in the A. I think it's just, as far as combat archetypes are concerned, it's probably one of the best ones. And, you know, there's nothing really stopping you from picking it up if you want to. All right, last one. Oh, gosh, I'm tired. I've been recording for nearly 2 hours, though a lot of it's going to be cut out. But the tier lists take a while. What can I say? Anyway, let's talk about Duelist. Duelist is very similar to the last 2 archetypes that we looked at. Very similar to Dual Weapon Warrior, very similar to Drow Shootist. It's a pure, like, martial style archetype. I don't think there's any requirement. Oh, you need to be trained in light armor and simple weapons. So it's a little bit more exclusive accessibility wise than Dual Weapon Warrior is. This one requires light armor proficiency. So I'm going to still give it 3 points because this is predominantly a martial archetype, and almost all martials, I think all martial classes have trained proficiency in light armor. So this one is just especially not for some spellcasters, even though this is a one-handed one, so you could have, well, I think your offhand has to be empty too. So yeah, no, this one just kind of sucks a little bit more for spellcasters, but honestly, it's not meant for spellcasters, it's meant for martials. So I'm not going to make it less than like Dual Weapon Warrior, because the people who would take it would also possibly take this one as well. But this one is it's just a little bit more biased against spellcasters. So, you know, that's just how it is. Functionality wise, this is a great archetype for if you want to play a duelist, a one-handed weapon user. There are also some classes that really could benefit from this, like the Thaumaturge, for instance. Though the Thaumaturge does need to use something in their offhand typically. There are ways around this, honestly, especially if they're using a weapon implement specifically. So, that being the case, it also has some train proficiency stuff. I do like a lot of its features. I'm going to mark this a little bit lower than the dual weapon wielder, though, because overall, it doesn't do enough, I feel like, to make just a single weapon really compare to like a two-handed weapon, for instance, or whatever else you could be feeling in that offhand. The parry stuff does kind of make up for having a shield if, you didn't want to use a shield. But again, I don't feel like it adds enough for having a hand be free. But I will say, no, actually, I'm going to give this a 5 because of how the aesthetic and the overall feats work. You can actually swap some of your feats. Once you pick up the Student of the Dueling Arts, you can swap any number of your Duelist archetype feats as long as it's not the Initial Dedication or Student of the Dueling Arts. And you can also utilize the stances by taking an additional action even if you don't have the feat, meaning that you gain access to all of the it's so flexible. You can do so much of it. You can take only the feats you need, swap them on your daily preparations. You can use the stances without actually putting points. Like picking up Student of the Dueling Arts is worth like several feats of functionality. It's so good that I'm going to actually give this 5 for dueling, because if you want to be a duelist, this is the archetype to take. And not only that, but its extra flexibility allows you to only have the feats that you need to take, and you don't even need to worry about retraining like almost every other class and archetype does, which is really, really good. 5 points with a gold star. I think its functionality goes a bit above and beyond what is called for with just Student of the Dueling Arts. That one feat is just so good. And as far as its fantasy is concerned, for fantasy fulfillment, I think this is going to be a lot more than Dual Weapon Warrior. Honestly, the overall aesthetic is that you are someone who's trained in dueling specifically. Student of the Dueling Arts makes your character seem like they're so knowledgeable. They have a whole list of different techniques, and they just need to change up the way they fight in a given day to kind of readjust that. So I think like it has that kind of appeal to it, and it has a lot of flourishiness to it. Honestly, it has a lot of flourishiness to it, especially with some of the stance, some of the abilities to disarm. You could very easily disarm using this archetype, and that's just straight styling on someone in game, which is a really good feeling for characters who want to like show combat superiority. So I feel like with the ease of access for that alone, as well as the general class's flexibility in the way that you can kind of set yourself up to look like someone who's just, so much about dueling that it just takes you a day's preparation to kind of like pick up some new techniques. I think the Duelist is going to get 4 points, not 5, because it doesn't offer really anything other than its functionality towards leaning towards it. But I feel like the functionality speaks for itself, and your ability to style on people with disarming is just classic tabletop. So I think 4 points is good. So that's 3, 5, and 4. This is going to give 12 points, which is going to put it at the top rankings along with some of the other archetypes as well in A. And our A list is big. We added a couple more, only 2 to S tier, which is interesting. We added more last time, but I don't think there should be too many S tiers as far as my ranking. And honestly, when I think about Alter Ego or Clockwork Reanimator, I don't think S tier. But as far as my ranking or like my system is concerned, well, there they are. And I'm gonna stick by my ranking system as far as this tier list is concerned. So this is my overall opinion. You don't have to like it. You don't even have to really agree with me. This is just what I feel, and based on, my criteria. If you agree with that, you do. Different people weight the game in different ways. So I'll let you all be the judge. But here is my tier list so far. So with that, it's going to be it. I'm tired, so I'm probably going to go lay down. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoy. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me. I'll see y'all next time. Bye.